The wind carved through the canyon walls like a knife through leather, carrying with it the scent of dust and forgotten dreams. Samuel Hartwell stood on the rotting porch of what had once been the finest ranch house in 3 counties, his weathered hands gripping a whiskey bottle that had become his most faithful companion. 17 years had passed since that terrible night, and the ghost of his boy still haunted every shadow, every creek and board, every sunrise that reminded him he was still breathing when his son was not. The Broken Arrow Ranch had earned its name long before Samuel's world collapsed. Now it seemed prophetic, a monument to shattered hopes and the cruel arithmetic of loss. The cattle had wandered off or been stolen years ago. The fences had surrendered to wind and neglect, and the bunkhouse stood empty as a tomb. Samuel had driven away every hand who'd tried to stay, every neighbor who'd offered help, every preacher who dared speak of God's mysterious ways. "Ain't no mystery to it," he muttered to the empty air, words slurred by bourbon and bitterness. Boy deserved better than what this world gave him. Thunder rumbled in the distance, promising another storm that would find its way through the gaps in the roof he'd never bothered to fix. Samuel had grown to welcome the rain's intrusion. The way it pooled on his kitchen floor and dripped into the rusted pots had scattered around like some demented percussion section. The decay matched his soul's condition, and there was honesty in that symmetry. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through his brooding like a church bell through Sunday silence. Samuel's hand instinctively moved to the Colt .45 that hung loose in its holster, though he hadn't cleaned the weapon in months. Visitors were rare, and in his experience, they brought nothing but trouble or pity. He wasn't sure which was worse. A lone rider emerged from the heat shimmer, moving slow and deliberate across the hardpan. The stranger sat his horse like a man carrying invisible weight, his shoulders curved forward as if braced against a wind that existed only in his mind. As he drew closer, Samuel could make out the details that time had carved into memory's stone. The narrow face, the dark hair now streaked with premature silver, the eyes that had once burned with youthful fury. "Jesus Christ," Samuel whispered, the bottle slipping from his fingers to shatter against the porch boards. The rider was Jake Morrison, the man who had put 3 bullets into 17-year-old Thomas Hartwell on a dusty street in Copper Falls all those years ago. The man who had walked free from the courthouse because the judge ruled it a fair fight, even though Thomas had been drunk and barely able to stand. The man who had stolen Samuel's reason for living and left him to rot in this desert purgatory. Jake Morrison had come home. The horse stopped 20 yards from the porch, close enough for Samuel to see the lines that grief and guilt had etched around Jake's eyes. The younger man's hands rested easy on his saddle horn, but Samuel noticed the way his fingers trembled, almost imperceptibly. They stared at each other across the years and the dust, 2 men bound together by the worst moment of their lives. "Mr. Hartwell," Jake said finally, his voice carrying the weight of every sleepless night he'd endured. "I know you got no cause to listen to me, but I need to say some things. Been carrying 'em too long." Samuel's hand found his pistol grip, muscle memory overriding the whiskey's influence. "You got a powerful lot of nerve riding onto my land, Morrison, after what you done." "I know it." Jake's eyes never left Samuel's face. "Been trying to work up the courage for near on 5 years now. Keeps eating at me what happened, what I did to your boy." "What you did?" Samuel's voice cracked like a whip. "You murdered him, you son of a bitch. Shot him down in the street like a dog." The words hung between them like smoke from a signal fire, carrying messages of pain and rage that had fermented in darkness for too long. Jake's face remained steady, accepting the blow, as if he had been expecting it, preparing for it, maybe even hoping for it. "That's right," Jake said quietly. "I killed him, and I ain't had a peaceful moment since." Samuel drew his weapon, the familiar weight of it steadying his bourbon-weakened grip. The barrel found Jake's chest with practiced ease, and Samuel's thumb pulled back the hammer with a sound like breaking bones. Here was the moment he'd dreamed of for 17 years, the chance to balance the scales that God had left tilted toward injustice. "Give me one good reason why I shouldn't put you in the ground right now," Samuel growled. Jake's eyes closed for a moment, and when they opened, Samuel saw something that stopped him cold. There was no fear there, no desperate plea for mercy. Instead, there was something that looked almost like relief, as if Jake had been waiting for this moment as long as Samuel had. "Because I got something belongs to you," Jake said, reaching slowly into his shirt pocket. "Something your boy was carrying when he died." Samuel's breath caught in his throat as Jake withdrew a small, worn photograph. Even from the distance, Samuel could see it was the picture of Thomas's mother, the one the boy had carried everywhere after she died of fever when he was 12. The photograph Samuel had searched for desperately after the funeral, the one small thing that would have given him comfort in the dark years that followed. "How long you had that?" Samuel's voice was barely above a whisper. "Since that night," Jake replied. "Found it in the street, after everything. Been carrying it ever since, looking at it every morning and every night, remembering what I took from this world." The gun wavered in Samuel's grip. 17 years of imagined vengeance had never included this moment, this strange gift from the man who had destroyed his life. The photograph represented everything Samuel had lost, but also everything he had forgotten in his descent into despair. "Why?" Samuel asked, the word torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "Why bring it now?" Jake's horse shifted restlessly, sensing the tension that crackled between the two men like electricity before a storm. The rider steadied his mount with a gentle touch, then looked back at Samuel with eyes that held depths of sorrow Samuel had never imagined possible. "Because I'm dying," Jake said simply. The words struck Samuel like physical blows, each syllable carrying weight that threatened to buckle his knees. He'd spent 17 years fantasizing about Jake Morrison's death, planning it, praying for it. But hearing the man announce his own mortality felt like being cheated of something essential. "What kind of dying?" Samuel asked, his gun still trained on Jake, but his conviction wavering. Jake's hand moved to his chest, pressing against his shirt as if trying to hold something inside. "Doctor in Denver says it's my heart, all worn out from carrying what I done. Says I got maybe a month, maybe less." Samuel studied the man's face, looking for signs of deception, but found only the hollow resignation of someone who'd already made peace with his fate. The years had not been kind to Jake Morrison. His face was gaunt. His skin had the gray pallor of a man whose body was already beginning its surrender, and his breathing carried the shallow rhythm of someone whose time was measured in heartbeats. "So you come here to clear your conscience before you meet your maker," Samuel's voice dripped with contempt. "Think you can just hand over that picture and wash the blood off your hands?" "No, sir," Jake's response came quick and firm. "Ain't nothing gonna wash that clean. I come here to tell you the truth about that night, the truth nobody heard in that courtroom." Samuel's finger tightened on the trigger. Part of him wanted to end this conversation with gunpowder and lead, to deny Jake Morrison the absolution he seemed to be seeking. But another part, a part that had been sleeping for 17 years, stirred with something that might have been curiosity. "Talk fast," Samuel said. Jake dismounted slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. He kept his hands visible, making no move toward the gun at his hip. The photograph remained clutched in his left hand, that small piece of cardboard that had somehow bridged the chasm between two broken men. "Your boy didn't start that fight," Jake said. "I did." The confession hit Samuel like a physical blow. According to every witness, every newspaper account, every legal document from the trial, Thomas Hartwell had been the aggressor. A drunk kid looking for trouble, pushing a fight with a man who'd tried to walk away. It was the one detail that had tormented Samuel most, the idea that his son had brought his death upon himself. "You're lying," Samuel whispered. "I wish I was." Jake's voice carried the weight of absolute truth. "Your boy was drunk, that's true enough, but he wasn't looking for trouble. He was crying." The detail stopped Samuel's heart for a moment. Thomas had been a proud boy, stubborn as mountain stone, but he'd inherited his mother's tender heart. The idea of him crying in public, vulnerable and exposed, painted a picture that Samuel had never imagined. Crying about what? About his mama, about missing her, about wishing she was there to see him become a man. Jake's eyes fixed on the photograph in his hand. He was showing this picture to anyone who'd listen, telling stories about how she used to sing to him, how she'd make him laugh when he was scared of the dark. Samuel's gun hand began to shake. The bourbon and the shock were conspiring to undermine his balance, but something deeper was happening. A wall he'd built around his heart was developing cracks, and through those fissures, old memories were beginning to seep. "I was already half drunk myself," Jake continued, "had been for days. My own troubles were eating at me, and I wasn't thinking straight. When I saw your boy crying over that picture, something in me just snapped, reminded me of my own weakness, my own pain. So I said things, cruel things, about his mama, about him being a crybaby, about how she was probably glad to be dead so she wouldn't have to see what a disappointment her son turned out to be." Each word was like a knife twisting in Samuel's chest. He could see it now, could picture his sensitive boy being torn apart by vicious words from a stranger who knew nothing about the love that had existed in the Hartwell house before death had poisoned it. "He came at me then," Jake said, "not with his gun, but with his fists, swinging wild, tears streaming down his face, calling me every name he could think of. I could have walked away, should have walked away, but I was drunk and angry and hurting, and I let my pride make the choice." "So you shot him?" "I shot him." Jake's voice broke on the words. 3 times. Once would have been enough, but I kept pulling the trigger, kept shooting until he was down and still. And then I looked at his face, and I saw he was just a boy, just a heartbroken boy who missed his mama. Samuel's vision blurred with tears he hadn't shed in years. The story Jake was telling rewrote everything Samuel thought he knew about his son's death. Thomas hadn't been a troublemaker or a drunk spoiling for a fight. He'd been a young man in pain, defending his mother's memory against a stranger's cruelty. "Why didn't you tell this to the judge?" Samuel asked. "Because I was a coward," Jake said simply. "Because I was afraid of hanging, and because I let my lawyer convince me that the truth would just make things worse. So I kept quiet and let everyone believe your boy was the one to blame." The gun in Samuel's hand felt impossibly heavy. For 17 years, he'd carried the additional burden of shame, the belief that he'd somehow failed to raise his son properly, that Thomas's death was partly his own fault for not teaching the boy better judgment. Now that weight was lifting, replaced by a different kind of pain. "You destroyed my life," Samuel said, but the words lacked the venom they'd carried moments before. "I know it,
and I destroyed my own along with it." Jake's eyes found Samuel's again. "Haven't had a full night's sleep since. Haven't been able to look at my own reflection without seeing your boy's face. Haven't been able to pray without hearing his voice calling for his mama as he died." The photograph in Jake's hand trembled as his strength began to fail. Samuel could see the man's lips turning blue, could hear the labored breathing that spoke of a heart struggling to maintain its rhythm. Whatever time Jake Morrison had left, it was running out faster than either of them had expected. "I come here to return what's yours," Jake said, extending the photograph toward Samuel. "And to tell you that your boy died defending something beautiful. He died for love, Mr. Hartwell, for the memory of his mama and the honor of his family." Samuel holstered his gun and stepped down from the porch. The photograph passed between them like a peace treaty. 17 years of hatred and grief concentrated in that small exchange. As Samuel's fingers touched the worn edges of his wife's image, he felt something shift inside him, some fundamental change that he couldn't yet name. "What happens now?" Samuel asked. Jake Morrison smiled then, the first genuine expression Samuel had seen on his face. It was the smile of a man who had finally set down a burden too heavy to carry any longer. "Now I die with something closer to peace," Jake said. "And maybe you get to live with something closer to the truth." The desert wind picked up, swirling dust devils around the two men as they stood in the shadow of the decaying ranch house. Samuel clutched the photograph to his chest, feeling the weight of his wife's memory and his son's honor settling into his bones like medicine he'd been refusing to take for far too long. Jake Morrison swayed on his feet, one hand pressed against his chest as his heart struggled to maintain its failing rhythm. The confession had cost him dearly, but his eyes held a clarity that Samuel recognized as the look of a man who had finally told the truth after years of living with lies. "There's something else," Jake said, his voice growing weaker with each word. "Something I need to show you before my time runs out." Samuel watched as Jake reached into his saddlebags with trembling hands, withdrawing a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coins. The bag was worn smooth from handling, and Samuel could see that it was heavy with more than just money. "What's that?" Samuel asked. "Every dollar I ever earned after that night," Jake replied. 17 years of wages, tips, rewards, everything. Been saving it all for this moment, for when I finally worked up the courage to face you." Samuel stared at the pouch, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. How much? Near on $4,000. Jake's breathing was becoming more labored. "Enough to rebuild your ranch, buy new cattle, fix what's broken. I know it can't bring your boy back, but maybe it can help you build something in his memory." The offer hung in the air between them, like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Samuel's first instinct was to refuse, to throw the blood money back in Jake's face and send him away to die alone. But as he looked around at the ruins of his life, at the collapsed fences and rotting buildings that had once been his pride and joy, he began to see something else. "Why?" Samuel asked. "Why save it all these years?" Jake's smile was sad but genuine. "Because I kept thinking about what your boy might have become if I hadn't cut his life short. Kept wondering what he would have built, what he would have accomplished. This money, it's my way of trying to honor that potential." Samuel felt something breaking inside him, some wall of ice that had been protecting his heart for 17 years. The tears came then, hot and cleansing, washing away the accumulated poison of nearly 2 decades of hatred and despair. "I hated you," Samuel whispered. "Every day for 17 years, I hated you." "I know," Jake replied. "I hated myself just as much."
The two men stood in silence as the desert wind continued its ancient song around them. Samuel found himself looking at Jake Morrison not as the monster he'd imagined, but as a broken man who had been carrying his own burden of grief and guilt all these years. "Your boy's name was Thomas," Jake said suddenly. "Thomas Michael Hartwell. I know because I found his identification after the shooting, and I've been saying his name out loud every morning since, like a prayer or a penance." Samuel's breath caught in his throat. In all his fantasies of revenge, he'd never imagined that Jake might have honored his son's memory in such a personal way. "He was going to be a rancher," Samuel said, the words coming easier now. "Like his grandfather and his great-grandfather before him. Had a gift with horses, could gentle the wildest mustang with just his voice and his patience." Jake nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I can see that in him. Even in that moment, even when he was angry and hurt, there was something noble about him, something that spoke of good breeding and good raising." The confession continued to work its way through Samuel's system like strong medicine, bitter but necessary. He found himself remembering things about Thomas that had buried under layers of grief and guilt. The boy's laughter, his curiosity about the world, his dreams of expanding the ranch and maybe starting a family of his own someday. He was planning to ask Mary Catherine O'Brien to marry him.
Had been saving up for a ring, talking about building a house on the north section of the property. What happened to her? Married a banker from Phoenix. Got 3 kids now, I hear. Sometimes I wonder if she thinks about Thomas, if she remembers what they had planned together. Jake's hand went to his chest again, and Samuel could see the man's strength fading like water through sand. Whatever time they had left to talk was running out fast. "I need to ask you something," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to know if you can find it in your heart to forgive me. Not for my sake, but for yours. A man can't live with that much hate and still call it living." Samuel looked at the dying man before him, seeing not the devil he'd imagined, but a fellow human being who had made a terrible mistake and spent 17 years trying to atone for it. The photograph in his hand seemed to pulse with warmth, and Samuel could almost hear his wife's voice urging him toward mercy. "I forgive you," Samuel said, the words coming from a place deeper than conscious thought. "God help me, I forgive you, Jake Morrison." Jake's face crumpled with relief, and he sank to his knees in the dust. Samuel moved quickly to support him, catching the dying man before he could fall completely. "Thank you," Jake whispered. "Thank you for giving me that gift." As Samuel held Jake Morrison in his arms, he felt something shifting inside himself, some fundamental change that went deeper than forgiveness. The hatred that had sustained him for 17 years was dissolving, replaced by something that felt almost like peace. Jake died as the sun touched the horizon, his last breath carrying away the final echoes of that terrible night in Copper Falls. Samuel held him until the end, 2 broken men finding redemption in each other's arms under the vast desert sky. Later, as Samuel dug a grave beside the cemetery where his wife and son were buried, he found himself thinking about the future for the first time in years. The $4,000 would rebuild the ranch, but more than that, it would give him a purpose beyond mere survival. He would build something beautiful in Thomas's memory, something that honored the young man's dreams and the love that had existed in the Hartwell family before tragedy had torn it apart. The Broken Arrow Ranch would rise again, not as a monument to despair, but as a testament to the power of forgiveness and the possibility of redemption. As he placed the simple wooden cross over Jake Morrison's grave, Samuel whispered a prayer for both men's souls, feeling the weight of 17 years of hatred finally lifting from his shoulders. The desert wind carried his words away into the gathering darkness, where they joined the eternal song of those who had found peace at last. The photograph of his wife remained clutched in his hand, a reminder that love endures even when life fails, and that sometimes the greatest courage is found in the simple act of letting go.